Frank should have listened to the clerk's warning about keeping those curtains closed. Some rules exist for reasons that only become clear when it's already too late. The desert Roadside Motel sat like a dying animal beside Highway 40, its neon sign flickering weakly against the Nevada twilight. Frank had been driving for 14 hours straight, his eyes burning from the endless ribbon of asphalt. When he finally spotted the motel's dim glow through his windshield, Frank pulled his truck into the lot, the diesel engines rumble echoing off the motel's weathered concrete walls. As he climbed down from the cab, the desert air hit him like a furnace, even though the sun was already sinking toward the horizon. The fuel gauge on his 18-wheeler was dancing dangerously close to empty, and the next truck stop was still 60 miles ahead. The parking lot was nearly deserted, except for 2 other big rigs and a rusted sedan that looked like it hadn't moved in months. Earl gave him a key attached to a plastic diamond-shaped tag and started to turn away, then paused. The motel office was a cramped, wood-paneled room that smelled of cigarettes and industrial disinfectant. "Promise me you'll follow it." Behind the counter sat a thin man in his 60s, his skin leathery from years of desert sun. His name tag read Earl, and he looked up at Frank with eyes that seemed oddly alert for someone working the night shift at a roadside motel. The carpet was stained, the bedspread looked like it hadn't been washed since the Reagan administration, and the air conditioner wheezed like an old man with emphysema. Frank cranked up the ancient air conditioner, but it barely made a dent in the oppressive heat. He considered opening the window, but the metal frame was painted shut and looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. The curtains were thick and lined with what felt like vinyl, designed to keep out every photon of light. He pulled them aside and saw his truck parked directly below, its chrome bumper gleaming in the fading daylight. The blackout curtains seemed to trap every bit of heat, creating a stifling environment that made his clothes stick to his skin. Frank peered through the gap and saw something moving near his truck. At first, he thought it was just a stray dog or coyote, but as his eyes adjusted to the moonlight, he realized the shape was wrong. It stood perfectly still for a long moment, then began moving toward the motel with that same unsettling, puppet-like walk. The view also included the empty desert stretching endlessly toward the mountains. Frank squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, when the creature suddenly stopped and turned toward the motel. But the room had one notable feature: heavy, black curtains that completely blocked the single window, making the room feel like a tomb. Cool desert air immediately flowed through the opening, and he sighed with relief. It moved along the walkway outside the rooms, pausing at each door and window as if searching for something. Through the gap, he could see the motel's parking lot bathed in pale moonlight and the distant glow of the highway. The creature was following the light. The scratching continued for several more minutes, accompanied by a low, wet sound that might have been breathing. He approached the window slowly, his hands shaking as he reached for the curtain. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The scratching sound grew louder, more frantic, as if the thing was trying to claw its way through the window. Keep the blackout curtains fully drawn from dusk till dawn, no matter what you hear outside. His truck sat undisturbed in the moonlight, and there was no sign of the creature anywhere. They were too large to be human, with fingers that stretched impossibly long. The glass was spiderwebbed, with cracks radiating out from where the thing had pressed its palm. Earl was still behind the counter, looking like he hadn't slept either. The thing's skin was gray and mottled, hanging loose in places like it was several sizes too large. The thing stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, its eyeless face turned toward the gap in the curtains. Just before dawn, he heard Earl's voice in the parking lot, talking to someone in hushed tones. Then it raised one of its grotesque hands and pressed it against the glass. Its fingers were elongated and ended in yellowed claws that scraped against the concrete as it moved. And the Desert Rose Motel's one rule wasn't meant to protect the property. It was meant to protect the guests from from the things that come crawling out of the desert darkness, drawn like moths to even the faintest glimmer of human light. Don't open them. Don't peek through them. Don't even touch them once the sun goes down. Need a room for the night? Frank said, pulling out his wallet. Earl nodded slowly, his fingers drumming against the counter. Earl's warning echoed in his mind, but the old man was probably just eccentric. What harm could there be in cracking the curtains open just an inch? He thinks he can see shapes moving in his peripheral vision, following the glow of his headlights, okay? And he always makes sure to stay at well-lit truck stops, surrounded by other drivers in bright fluorescent lights, okay? Just enough to let in a little air, maybe catch a breeze. The darkness out here is hungry, and light is what feeds it. Room 12 is available. It's got a good view of the parking lot, so you can keep an eye on your rig. He slid a registration card across the counter. That'll be $45. Frank filled out the card and handed over the cash. One thing, Earl said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Frank raised an eyebrow. That's a strange rule. It's the only rule that matters, Earl replied, his eyes meeting Frank's with an intensity that made the trucker's skin crawl. Frank shrugged. Sure, whatever. Room 12 was exactly what Frank had expected from a $45 motel room. Frank dropped his overnight bag on the bed and immediately went to the window. The stuffiness of the sealed room was already getting to him. By 9 o'clock, Frank was sweating and irritable. He tried to sleep, but the room felt like a sauna despite the air conditioner's valiant efforts. He stood in front of the window, his hand hovering over the curtain's edge. Frank pinched the curtain between his thumb and forefinger and pulled it aside, just enough to create a narrow gap. For the first time since entering the room, Frank felt like he could breathe. He was about to return to bed when he heard it, a soft, scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across concrete. The thing was roughly human-sized, but moved with an odd, jerky gait. Its limbs seemed too long, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Frank's breath caught in his throat. The thing's face was a pale oval in the moonlight, but where its eyes should have been, there were only dark hollows. Frank's instinct was to slam the curtain shut, but he found himself frozen, watching as the creature approached the building. Shh. Then Frank realized what it was looking for. The thin line of light escaping through his cracked curtains was visible from outside, a golden thread in the darkness. As it drew closer, Frank could see more details that made his stomach turn. The creature stopped directly in front of Frank's window. Frank held his breath, not daring to move. The window began to rattle in its frame. Frank finally found the strength to move. He yanked the curtains shut just as the glass started to crack under the pressure of the creature's touch. Frank backed away from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. Frank waited in the silence, sweat dripping down his face despite the cool air that had briefly entered the room. Through the gap he'd created earlier, he could see the parking lot was empty again. But on the outside of the window, pressed against the glass, were handprints. Frank didn't sleep that night. He sat on the bed, staring at the curtains, listening to every sound from outside. Room 12 again, Earl was saying. Same as always. They're drawn to any light after dark. How long has it been this time? The other voice was unfamiliar, gravelly. 3 months since the last incident. We're getting better at warning people. Frank checked out before the sun was fully up, eager to get back on the road. Find everything to your liking, Earl asked, though his eyes were focused on something over Frank's shoulder. Fine, Frank muttered, dropping the key on the counter. As Frank walked toward the door, Earl called out one final time. Next time you're driving through, remember, some rules exist for good reasons. Frank never took that route again, but sometimes, on long nights when he's driving through empty desert highways. Because Frank learned that night that some motels have rules for reasons that go beyond simple courtesy. In the Desert Rose Motels, one rule wasn't meant to protect the property. It was meant to protect the guests from the things that come crawling out of the desert darkness, drawn like moths to even the faintest glimmer of human light. Maya would later realize that the worst part wasn't finding the rules carved into the desk. It was understanding that she'd already been following them for 3 days without knowing why. The Sleepy Inn Motel sat like a decaying tooth along Highway 82, its neon sign flickering between VA and ANCY in the November rain. Maya Chen pulled her Honda Civic into the gravel parking lot, windshield wipers squeaking against the glass. She was 3 hours behind schedule, her phone battery dead, and the nearest town still 40 miles away. The motel would have to do. The metal stairs groaned under her weight, and she noticed that several of the other room numbers had been torn away, leaving only the ghostly outlines of digits on faded doors. Room 237 was at the far end, tucked into a corner where the hallway light didn't quite reach. The clerk behind the bulletproof glass was a skeletal man with yellowed fingers, who barely looked up when Maya slid her credit card through the slot. Room 237, he wheezed, pushing a brass key across the counter. Checkouts at 11. Maya's footsteps echoed in the outdoor corridor as she made her way to the second floor. But when she pressed her ear to the wall, the voices would stop. He looked at her with roomy eyes and said, "Lights work fine. You sure you tried to switch?" When Maya insisted she had, he shrugged and returned to his crossword puzzle. Maintenance ain't coming till Thursday. The only illumination came from the pale glow of the parking lot lights seeping through the thin curtains. Maya sighed and fumbled for her phone before remembering it was dead. The process took longer than expected, and by the time she returned to the motel, exhaustion had settled into her bones. She navigated the dark room by memory now, the parking lot glow her only guide. She read the rules again, then a third time, her mind racing. 3 nights. She'd been here for 3 nights. She'd tried the lights on the first night, hadn't she? It had come from inside the wall, right next to where she stood. 3 measured knocks, then silence. The voice was barely a whisper, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Maya, are you listening?" She'd flicked the switch up and down, trying to make them work. She'd grown accustomed to the shadows, even finding a strange comfort in them. She'd have to ask the clerk about the lights in the morning. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the dark shapes of the furniture, when she noticed something odd about the desk. Something else. A darkness that seemed to absorb the light, moving with its own liquid rhythm. Maya forced herself to look away, pressing her face against the wall as the white noise grew louder, punctuated by sounds that might have been voices or might have been screaming. As she watched, frozen in terror, the darkness began to take shape. Fingers, then a hand, then an arm reaching toward her. She left the key on the desk next to the carved rules, but before she walked out, she pulled a pen from her purse and added one final line below the others. In her rearview mirror, she saw him emerge from behind the counter, shambling toward the stairs with a brass key marked 237 glinting in his yellowed fingers. Someone had tried to warn her, just as she'd tried to warn whoever came next. But warnings only work if people read them before it's too late. The key turned with surprising ease, and Maya stepped into the musty darkness. Maya approached the desk cautiously, running her fingers over the scarred wood. The white lead beam illuminated the desktop, revealing words etched directly into the wood grain. She'd broken 3 rules already, maybe more, and she'd been here for 3 nights, the maximum stay according to rule number 7, past midnight. Rule number 2 flashed through her mind, but her feet were already moving toward the bed, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't resist. Maya's breath caught in her throat as she read. The scratches felt deep, carved with something sharp and methodical. The light spun wildly, casting dizzying shadows across the walls, before settling on the corner of the room where a figure stood perfectly still. Not a shadow, too solid, too real. It watched her with eyes that reflected the phone's light like a cat's. Rule number 3. If you hear knocking, don't answer. If you hear your name, don't respond. Rule number 4. The shadow in the corner isn't a shadow. Ignore it. Rule number 5. Don't use the phone between 2 and 4 a.m. Rule number 6. If the TV turns on by itself, don't watch. Face the wall until it stops. Rule number 7. Don't stay longer than 3 nights. Rule number 8. If you're reading this, you've already broken rule number 1. She set her overnight bag on the bed and felt her way to the bathroom, where a small nightlight provided just enough visibility to brush her teeth and change into her pajamas. She felt along the wall for the light switch, her fingers finding the familiar plastic toggle. She flicked it up. Nothing happened, but she tried again, clicking the switch up and down several times, but the room remained shrouded in blackness. Using the faint light from outside, Maya navigated around the room's sparse furniture, a sagging bed with a paisley comforter, a small TV mounted on the wall, and an old wooden desk pushed against the far wall. That first night, Maya slept fitfully, wakened repeatedly by sounds she couldn't identify. Soft scratching in the walls, the distant hum of machinery, and what sounded like whispered conversations from the room next door. The next morning, she complained to the clerk about the lights. Maya spent the day at the nearby college campus, interviewing for a graduate program. On the third night, Maya couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building seemed amplified. Every whisper of wind through the parking lot sounded like voices calling her name. There were scratches in the wood surface, not random gouges, but deliberate marks that caught what little light filtered through the curtains. She pulled out her phone, turning on the flashlight function she'd forgotten about in her exhaustion. Rules for room 237. Rule number 1. Don't turn on the lights. Rule number 2. Don't look under the bed after midnight. Maya's hands began to shake, the phone's light wavering across the carved text. A soft knock echoed through the room. Maya's blood turned to ice. She looked toward the door, but the sound hadn't come from there. Maya. She clamped her hands over her ears, but the voice continued, growing clearer. Maya, you need to see what's under the bed. Her phone's flashlight beam trembled as she forced herself to look at the time. 12:47 a.m. She knelt on the worn carpet, her phone's light revealing dust bunnies, and Maya scrambled backward, her phone clattering to the floor. The TV crackled to life, filling the room with static. When the TV finally clicked off, Maya remained against the wall, counting her heartbeats. As dawn crept through the curtains, Maya packed her bag with shaking hands. Rule number 9. Don't leave this room until you've warned the next guest. The clerk didn't look up when Maya hurried past the office. Maya drove away, but she couldn't stop thinking about the rules carved into that desk. And everyone who needed to read those rules would make the same mistake she had. They'd turn on the lights first. Some sounds you hear in the middle of the night are meant to keep danger out. But what happens when those same sounds are keeping you in? Jess had always been a light sleeper, but the exhaustion from her 12-hour drive to Portland had knocked her out cold the moment her head hit the pillow. The business trip was supposed to be routine, a quick presentation to potential clients, one night in a decent hotel, then back home to Seattle. It was the distinct, metallic slide of her deadbolt turning, followed immediately by the soft rattle of the security chain being drawn across its track. A key, she lay perfectly still, listening to the silence that followed those sounds. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed 3:17 a.m. in harsh red numbers. She'd checked into the Grandview in just after midnight, a modest 3-story building that looked respectable enough from the outside. She knew she hadn't locked that door. This was a habit born from too many true crime podcasts and late-night horror stories. The deadbolt had been open, the chain hanging loose. She'd deliberately left them that way, preferring the psychological comfort of knowing she could get out quickly if needed. Every instinct told her to call the front desk, to demand an explanation, but her phone showed no signal. The deadbolt was indeed locked, turned to the horizontal position. The chain hung taut across its track, properly secured. Both locks showed no signs of tampering, no scratches or marks that would indicate forced entry. Her clothes were still draped over the chair, the curtains still drawn tight against the windows, but the sound had been real. She was certain of it. The dead zone was complete, as if the room had been sealed off from the outside world. What woke her was unto the usual sounds of a hotel at night. No footsteps in the hallway, no door slamming, no ice machine humming. Jess's eyes snapped open in the darkness, her heart already beginning to race. She knew she hadn't gotten up. When she'd arrived, Jess had done what she always did in hotels: checked the bathroom, looked under the bed, tested the locks. The shadows cast by her phone's light appeared deeper than they should be, creating pockets of darkness that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Now, someone or something had locked her in. It looked like a handprint, but wrong somehow. The fingers were too long, the palm too narrow, and it was on the inside of the window. The light spun crazily before coming to rest, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. She tried the chain, but it seemed fused to its track, immovable. She pulled and twisted and yanked until her fingers were raw, but the locks remained stubbornly in place. Jess slowly sat up, her breath coming in shallow, quiet gasps. The room was darker than it should have been. The thin sliver of light that had been seeping under the door from the hallway was gone, as if something was blocking it from the outside. It moved along the window, from right to left, as if something was walking across the narrow ledge outside. The room was silent again, but the silence was different now, expectant, hungry. Tap, 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 moving across the walls, circling her. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent, and she could feel something in the room with her, something that had been waiting patiently for her to discover it. The tapping stopped the moment she took her first step, plunging the room back into oppressive silence. The parking lot below was empty, lit by sparse streetlights that cast long shadows between the scattered cars. The ledge outside her window was narrow, barely wide enough for a pigeon to land on. It's rapid in the darkness, in the growing certainty that whatever had locked her in wasn't planning to let her out. The deadbolt was unlocked, the chain hanging loose. Jess was gone, but her belongings remained untouched. The only clue was a single handprint on the inside of the window, too long, too narrow, pressed against the glass from within. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, her fingers trembling as she activated the flashlight. The weak beam illuminated her hotel room in harsh white patches. Everything looked exactly as she'd left it. Her suitcase on the luggage rack, her laptop closed on the small desk, her jacket draped over the chair. But something felt wrong. The air in the room had changed, become thicker somehow, carrying a faint metallic taste that made her throat tighten. Jess swung her legs out of bed, her bare feet touching the rough carpet. She crept toward the door, her phone's light dancing ahead of her. That's when she heard it, a soft sound from behind her, like fabric brushing against fabric. Jess spun around, her light sweeping across the room. Nothing had moved. She backed against the door, feeling the cold metal of the deadbolt against her spine. The room seemed to be watching her, waiting. A new sound emerged from the silence, a slow, rhythmic tapping like fingernails against glass. It was coming from the window. Jess's blood turned to ice. She was on the second floor. The tapping continued, patient and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. She forced herself to move away from the door, her legs unsteady. With trembling hands, Jess reached for the curtains. She had to know what was out there. She had to see what was making that sound. The heavy fabric was ice cold against her fingers as she pulled it aside, just enough to peer through the gap. There was nothing there. As she started to pull the curtain closed, she saw it, a dark smudge on the glass, right at eye level. Jess stumbled backward, her phone clattering to the floor. She lunged for the door, her fingers fumbling with the deadbolt. It wouldn't turn. Behind her, the tapping resumed, but now it was coming from inside the room. Jess pressed her back against the door and closed her eyes, willing herself to wake up to find that this was all just a nightmare brought on by exhaustion and stress. When she finally opened her eyes, the tapping had stopped. The last thing Jess remembered clearly was the sound of her own breathing. Harsh the next morning, housekeeping found her door standing wide open. The hotel still rents that room to guests, but if you ever stay there, you might want to check the locks twice before you go to sleep. And if you hear that distinctive sound of a deadbolt sliding shut in the middle of the night, don't assume it's keeping the danger out. Sometimes it's keeping something in. And with that final story, we pull back from the abyss. For now, tales of ordinary lives brushing against the extraordinary, the terrifying, the unexplainable, from the shadow that mimics to the voice that calls from an empty house. We've seen tonight how thin the veil between our reality and a much darker one can be. These stories are not just fiction. They are born from real experiences, whispered in hushed tones, and shared to remind us that we are not always alone. And that's the most chilling thought, isn't it? Perhaps one of tonight's stories reminded you of something that happened to you, or to someone you know. A strange occurrence you've tried to forget. A noise in the night you rationalized away. A figure you saw for just a second. The details of your own brush with the darkness are what give this channel life. I invite you to leave your own story in the comments below. Let us know what you've seen in the shadows. If these stories sent a shiver down your spine, show your support by hitting that like button. It helps these tales reach others who need a reminder to check their locks at night. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell. We have so many more stories to share, and you won't want to be left in the dark. Until next time, remember that you are not afraid of being alone. You are afraid of the bone-deep certainty that you are not.